Good evening, everybody. Greetings. Come on in and find a seat. And I want to welcome all of you to Grace Church tonight. My name is Don Waring, and I am the rector of Grace Church, which means that on a good day, I am in charge of this place. It was nearly 8 years ago when Natalie Dykstra first contacted Grace Church. At the time, she was already an award-winning author as well as professor of English at Hope College. She was in the beginning stages of researching the life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, who would be the subject of the book we celebrate tonight. As you may know, Isabella was the founder of the famous museum in Boston that bears her name. She had grown up as a parishioner at Grace Church when this building was brand new. Natalie was inquiring to see if we had information in our archives that could fill in some gaps, and therein lies a story. Isabella's parents were David and Adelia Stewart, founding members of Grace Church who helped to build this edifice in 1846. Isabella was their firstborn, then came 3 more children, a girl and 2 boys. Sadly, of the 4 children, only Isabella would outlive the parents. The girl died just days shy of being 12 years old. The 2 sons died in their 20s. We can only imagine the depth of grief that these parents experienced. But rather than sinking into despair, what they did was to create a lasting statement of their reasonable and holy hope of eternal life with the children they had loved and lost. With the cooperation of the rector at the time, the Reverend Henry Codman Potter, the Stewarts commissioned the renowned artist Henry Holliday to design a stained glass window. The window depicts the raising of Lazarus, described in the Gospel of John, and the raising of Jairus' 12-year-old daughter in the Gospel of Mark. 141 years after its unveiling, the window shines for us still in the south aisle of the nave, the second one from the west. And my guess is, when you look at that window later on tonight, that the depiction of Jairus' 12-year-old daughter bears a striking resemblance to the daughter of David and Adelia Stewart. Soon after Natalie contacted us, I went to take a closer look at the window than I had ever given it before. And apart from the sheer beauty of color and light, my first thoughts were of the lifetime of loss and heartache that gave rise to its creation. Then I marveled at the courage and faith of David and Adelia, who determined to bring beauty out of their darkness. Finally, in looking at the crumbling plaster surrounding the window, I thought of a quote from one of my favorite practical, secular, irreverent theologians of a sort, none other than Phil Swift, who said, "Wow, that's a lot of damage. All the Flex Seal and Flex Tape in the world could not fix what is wrong over there." And I concluded it will be time soon for a capital campaign to fix these leaks for good. It may not be providence, but it surely is a holy coincidence that the publication of Natalie's new book, Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, overlaps with our capital campaign. Making All Things New aims to restore not only the very section of the church where the Stewart family window shines, but also some exterior facades of the parish house and rectory of this church that the family loved. In your pews, you will find brochures about the campaign, including the opportunity to contribute to our overall goal of $5 million. Every gift matters, and I hope you'll take advantage of the many Venmo codes tastefully displayed around the church. And let me say this, perhaps we have someone among us tonight who can seriously move the needle? If so, and the Spirit inspires you to give, please contact me or my colleague, Travis, here at the church. We're grateful tonight to be in partnership with our neighbors, the Strand Bookstore, just up the street. After Natalie's talk, she'll be at a table in the south aisle, not far from the Stewart window, signing books that you'll have the opportunity to purchase through the Strand. Thank you, Strand friends, for making this possible. Also, everyone is invited to enjoy wine and cheese and other beverages, compliments of the GCW, which stands for Grace Church Women. You'll find the refreshments up in the sanctuary, near the altar of the church. Someone asked in our planning stages, is it really appropriate to serve such things up by the altar? And I said, yes, it is. We serve bread and wine there every Sunday. So enjoy the reception, enjoy the talk. We are very glad that you're here. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Dykstra.
Wow. Can you hear me? All right. My mic is on. Thank you, Grace Church. To Don Waring for your generous welcome, and to Travis Brock Kennedy, who attended to all the details with such care. To Bonnie Recca, Rihanna Murphy, and Harry Kraus, who made it possible for me to include a photograph of the Stewart family window at the end of the first chapter, welcoming me and my photographer nephew, Benjamin Dykstra, who's here tonight, into this extraordinary sanctuary one sunny day last summer. I can hardly believe I'm here tonight, to be honest. It's not an exaggeration to say that the seeds of this book were planted 7 years ago when I first attended a worship service here. In my notebook, I scribbled impressions right after my first visit that would make it all the way to the book itself, like a kind of thrumming through line. Here's what I wrote in 2017, quote, "What struck me almost to tears while listening to the organ music fill those arched spaces is imagining little Belle in those pews. She was tiny for her age, but athletic, alert, and alive. People would later comment on her eyes. One aspect of the Gardner Museum that is hard to put in one's finger on is its religiosity. That's not quite the right word. Spirituality is a better word. I do know this. Belle was more devout, more pious than what's been known before. Maybe a way to say it is this. There's a direct but little-known line between Grace Church in New York City and her museum in Boston. For Belle, belief and beauty are joined, and relishing artistic splendor is the profoundest worship," unquote. So I'm especially glad and honored to be here. Isabella was a New York girl. Even after her marriage, she would sometimes make her escape from the often stifling social atmosphere of Boston's Brahmin society to the larger and bustling streets of New York. My task tonight is to introduce Isabella with a brief overview, and then I'd like to read a passage from an early chapter in the book, and then one towards the end. And if there are several themes to trace in Isabella's story, the one I'm following tonight, like a bright red thread, is her spirituality. Slide. But first, the question that was also common in her own time: who was Isabella Stewart Gardner? Someone who seemed to shimmer with an unknowable light. My favorite letter by Henry James to Isabella is his last one to her, dated April 20, 1914, quote, "You shine out to me with undiminished interest, and in your splendid setting of so much art and so much honor," he wrote, "I am your faithfulest and further back now surely than anyone, old Henry James." I love how her friend compared her to a jewel in a setting. She was born in 1840 in Manhattan, the oldest daughter of David and Adelia Stewart, slide, and lived first at 10 University Place. Her father was a merchant who traded in Irish and Scottish linen, and the family attended Grace Church, where they sat in pew number 187. Her nearby girls' school, with its high-ceilinged room, slide, was located on Clinton Place, now West 8th Street. The building is now the New York Studio School. In her 16th year, her parents took her to Paris, where she enrolled in a Protestant convent school. Her classmates were from around the world, but her closest friends were two girls from Boston, slide, Helen Waterston on the left, and Julia Gardner, whose older brother, Jack Gardner, would later come to Paris to join his family. We know Julia was Isabella's future sister-in-law, but who was Helen? After finding Helen's signature in Isabella's friendship album, a brief search brought me to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where I first read through her diaries. Slide. I won't forget the moment I turned to the page dated December 8, 1856. Here she describes first meeting Isabella Stewart, a New York girl. There she is, I thought, a teenager. Helen's vivid pages about their schooling and adventures comprise a never-before-told witness of Belle that rhymes with the woman she would become. By the time Isabella returned to New York, slide, she was already sophisticated, having seen much of the art of Paris, Florence, and Rome, and became fluent in those languages. In Milan, after seeing the private collection of Count Poldi Pezzoli, a home later transformed into a museum, she turned to a friend and said, "If I ever have any money of my own, I'm going to build a palace and fill it with beautiful things." Slide. At 20, she married Jack Gardner, a son of wealthy Boston Brahmin families, at Grace Church on the 10th of April, as recorded in the church register. Slide. Older brother George described Jack as handsome, quiet, and sufficiently at ease with the ladies. Where Belle was fiery, Jack was calm, and he thought Belle was the most interesting woman he had ever met. Early on, the young couple suffered terrible tragedies. After her first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth, they welcomed a blue-eyed boy, Slide, who was given his father's nickname, Jackie. In the waning weeks of the Civil War, Jackie died before his second birthday, Slide. It was a derailing grief, as if she'd been exiled from womanhood, when so much of being a woman was being a mother in those years. She fell into a long and deep sadness. What saved Belle was overseas travel, to Europe first, but then to Egypt, India, the Holy Lands, and later an extended tour of Asia, including Japan, China, Cambodia, Slide, all of which she meticulously documented in 28 large travel albums, as if she could put the world on a page. Here, the 13th century great Buddha at Kamakura in Japan in 1883 occupies the full page in one of her albums. A favorite motif on the right is Madonna and Child at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence from a visit there a few years later. During her 1874 trip down the Nile, Slide, she had trouble sleeping because she found the ancient sites so intoxicating. Here, her sketches accompany vivid diary entries. Listen to the sound of her voice after seeing by moonlight the Luxor complex at Karnak, with its hundreds of columns inscribed by hieroglyphics reaching to the sky. This is Isabella. Quote, "I never had such an experience, and I felt as if I never wanted to see anything again in this world, that I might shut my eyes to keep that vision clear. It was not beautiful, but grand, mysterious, solemn. I felt it even more than saw it." Unquote. Slide. By the 1880s, she and Jack had established a regular routine of travel in Europe every 2 years, tours which ended with a long stay in Venice, often at the Palazzo Barbaro on the Grand Canal. Many of her letters she later consigned to bonfires, asking others to do likewise, though once she became the famed Mrs. Jack, some people defied her wishes, and her surviving letters are full of wit and warmth. I love the pace and detail of this 1906 letter written when she was in Paris. Slide. "I am sitting by my high-up window overlooking gardens where a band is playing. Weather still cool and fresh. I saw Henry Adams yesterday and was with him in his auto all afternoon, seeing old cathedral glass and motoring through Versailles. These motor cars do cover the ground." Unquote. Slide. Isabella loved to move fast. She was a fast runner and spun across the dance floor. She loved speedy horses and buggy rides. She was not very tall, but she filled a room. She listened with great intensity, and people commented on her low, melodic voice. She had a remarkable memory for what she heard and saw, and an equally notable temper that sometimes got her into trouble. But her capacity to enjoy was life-giving, whether travel or slide, working in her gardens at their country estate in Brookline, slide, or raising puppies. She spent her 30s and 40s getting educated, studied Italian to read Dante, and attended lectures given by the art historian Charles Eliot Norton at Harvard. She invited scholars and writers and musicians for dinner. She first collected clothing and jewelry, slide, what was near at hand for a woman of her social class. Though Henry James teased her, "Don't spend all your money on dresses." Soon enough, on the advice of Norton, she turned to collecting rare books. She was gathering her forces, preparing and expanding and learning all the time. And since the mid-1870s, she and Jack attended the Church of the Advent, slide, on the flat of Beacon Hill. Advent had its origins in the 1840s Oxford movement, a revival in the Church of England which emphasized reverent worship closer to traditional Catholic practices. Isabella loved the drama of high church services with robes and rituals, incense and music, and recitation of prayers, all a reminder of her childhood here at Grace Church. But Advent's mission was also down to earth, inviting residents of poor neighborhoods for evening meals and religious instruction. Its rector, Charles Chapman Grafton, had established an Anglican monastic order called the Society of St. John the Evangelist in nearby Cambridge. Another of the brothers, Arthur Hall, became Belle's first spiritual mentor, teaching her to pray. Slide. When funds were needed to complete a sanctuary for the first Black Episcopal congregation in Boston, Isabella quietly gave $12,000. Her involvement with the order would endure. Her late-in-life donations enabled the brothers to build a monastery on a large plot of land bordering the Charles River, land she had also helped them to purchase. Slide. They, in turn, promised to conduct in perpetuity a memorial service every April 14 on her birthday. Her written instructions here are kept in the monastery's archives. A line she wrote down later may have served as her quiet creed, quote, "Our faith might cause our light to shine on some other heart, which as yet had no light of its own." Isabella began buying artwork early on, mostly by the French Barbizon painters, and soon their homes were full of treasures. Slide. These images by the architectural photographer Thomas Marr depict the Gardner home at 152 Beacon Street, and you can see a correlation between these rooms and her museum galleries later. By the time she bought Vermeer's The Concert in Paris in 1892, slide, she had trained her eye. That year, she had inherited money from her father's estate, and a rush of collecting followed. She surely had help from the art dealer Bernard Berenson and others, slide, when buying her wondrous Rembrandt self-portrait. On the Boston arrival of her Velázquez portrait of King Philip IV, slide, she wrote giddily to Berenson, "His Majesty is here." She put arguably the greatest masterpiece of her collection, Titian's Rape of Europa, slide, in her drawing room, next to the fireplace and candles. It was becoming increasingly clear to both Isabella and Jack that something had to be done to keep the collection secure. Slide. On a snowy night in late 1898, Jack Gardner collapsed from a stroke and died at the age of 61. Isabella's path to realizing her vision, the house with beautiful things, was again marked by grief. But she persisted. Slide. Plans were soon drawn up by her architect. What she was attempting to do was risky, sui generis. She fought with the city about its regulations. She had trouble keeping a skilled work crew because of her perfectionism. Slide. And yet, here she is on her ladder, overseeing the work crew. There's delight in her missives to Berenson, describing her frequent visits to the work site, overseeing innumerable crises and details, bringing along her lunch pail. Slide. As the century turned, the large palace with its plain exterior rose up on the marshland of the Fenway. Inside its 4 stories was a lush interior courtyard ringed by 3 stories of galleries and topped by a glass roof. Slide. Her singular accomplishment, a Venetian-style palazzo turned inside out, was filled room after room, not only with paintings, but tapestries, prints, porcelain, statues, manuscripts, stained glass, and fine furniture. She secured her vision by stipulating in her will that her installation of the galleries never be changed. Fenway Court, as the museum was known in its day, was open to an astonished public in the winter of 1903, almost 40 years after the birth of her son, Jackie. Isabella lived another 21 years, and these decades following the opening of the museum, I find some of the most moving. She talked of Asian art and Buddhism and loneliness with the Japanese curator Akakura. She was one of the sponsors of the Armory Show of Modern Art in 1913. There are scenes of her on Boston's North Shore with her bohemian friends, most of whom were gay and 20 years her junior. She liked to sit and sip hot milk, slide. Oh, there's Akakura. She liked to sit and sip hot milk, slide, in front of John Singer Sargent's masterwork, El Jaleo, in the Spanish cloister, as if watching a theater performance. And she lived long enough to know what she had accomplished. When a friend worried about her after her stroke in 1919, slide, she replied, "I am quite an invalid, but cheerful to the last degree. I keep up a lot of thinking, and I am really very much alive." Isabella lived a very large life, and its scale was something I had to grapple with. Henry Adams once said a biographer faces two kinds of challenges: too few sources about a subject or too many. And Isabella's archive has both at once. There is far less documentation of her early years. Slide. Her drawing book, and you can't see it, but it says, "This is done very badly." The extraordinary gift books, she had a lot of opinions even as a teenager. The extraordinary gift books, such as this one from her father, slide. Isabella Stewart from her father. It's always so moving to see that. A sketch, slide, from Jack while they were courting. Notice the arrow through the man's heart. I had the feeling sometimes I was weaving her story from gossamer threads, but all of it mattered. Slide. I laughed out loud when I first saw this envelope that reads, "Mrs. Gardner, Esquire, well-known lady in high life." The postmaster wrote, "Try Mrs. Jack." And of course it worked because we have it in the archives. Then, by the time she was collecting her masterpieces in the 1890s, I had the opposite challenge: a deluge of material, 7,500 pieces of art, 3,000 rare books, 1,000+ correspondence. Slide, reams of dealer files. These are the files that Jack would keep of their purchases. Her 28 travel albums, slide, 17 guest books, slide, large gallery cases filled with letters and other memorabilia, and Isabella's many lists, slide. She even titled a large leather-bound notebook, "List of Things for the Museum." Notice at the top, Europa by Titian, and I always love the one at the end, one Delacroix. Soon after Fenway Court opened, a friend noted, quote, "You have her when you have the museum. So much does it express Isabella's aesthetics, desires, preoccupations, and inner life." Slide. I remember the first time I went to the Gardner Museum more than 20 years ago. I was deep in my research for my first book on Clover Adams, the wife of Henry Adams. I'd been dreading writing about her death by suicide and needed some cheering up. Sitting on a bench looking into the soaring space of the museum's central courtyard, abloom with flowers, I mused, oh, to write about Isabella, someone so embracing of life. And yet earlier accounts of her seemed never quite to match the soulfulness of her creation, of the intimate feeling in the museum galleries, or of its astonishing sweep and the largeness of its spiritual claim. I began to wonder if the galleries could be understood, even in part, as a kind of three-dimensional album. So instead of paging through an album, one walks through the rooms of a palace. Slide. She intended a visitor to move through the museum in sequence, from the exuberant, blooming courtyard, up the staircase, through galleries that display the power of queens and kings and popes, to the quiet of an 18th century French salon, and so on, to the chapel, slide, at the end of the third floor gallery and its large stained glass window. This is what mattered to her. As one ascends one is immersed in the splendors of temporal power. But then a turn is made near the end to the spiritual and to everything that can never be contained in a museum. The remarkable story of Isabella Stewart Gardner follows an arc from a season of terrible losses early in her life to this woman. Slide. 3 decades later, on the balcony of the Palazzo Barbaro on Venice's Grand Canal, with fireworks flaring in the distance, the painter Anders Zorn portrays his friend in motion, with her arms flung wide, open to the world and experience, and stepping toward us. She was reported to have said that evening, quote, "Come out, all of you. This is too beautiful to miss." She would chase beauty her whole life, and as she did so, she was also chasing transcendence, a spiritual impulse she first learned here in these pews at Grace Church. I conclude with brief readings from 2 chapters in the book, and I promise they're brief. An excerpt from the 2nd chapter, A New York Girl, and then from chapter 31, Blood and Thunder, paragraphs about another stained glass window, this one made from the ruins of a French cathedral. Slide. At the bend of Broadway at 10th Street, 3 blocks north of the Stewart home, the wooden steeple of Grace Church, her grandmother's church in Jamaica was also called Grace Church, rose high above other buildings and treetops, visible from almost any angle in the city. The French Gothic Revival Sanctuary had been finished in 1846 after the church's older building, located downtown near Battery Park, was deemed too small for its growing congregation. Its architect, the 24-year-old prodigy James Renwick, who went on to build St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, had not yet been to Europe. So he studied every book on church architecture the congregation's leaders could find. When the Stewarts joined, and when Little Belle and her siblings attended, the sanctuary windows were a mix of clear and pastel-colored glass. The floor under the elevated pews was wood planking, and the walls and arches were made of Sing Sing marble, so called because it had been cut by inmates at the prison north of the city. George Loder, a distinguished composer from England, was the church's longtime musical director and organist. Slide. David Stewart, and here he is, and his son David Jr., would serve as a trustee and bought a pew as a founding member for $650, paying a yearly rent of $52. From pew number 189, Belle and her family had an unobstructed view of the pulpit near the front of the nave. In its fast-evolving neighborhood, Grace Church, a part of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, became one of the city's most fashionable congregations in the years before the Civil War. Surnames engraved on small brass plaques attached to pews were a who's who of antebellum New York, including Astor, Brevoort, Aspinwall, Stuyvesant, Edith Newbald Jones, later Wharton, born in 1862 to Lucretia Rhinelander and George Friedrich Jones, was christened in the church. The services were sometimes so packed that people would stand in the aisles or outside the windows to hear the preacher and the hymns. The pageantry of Grace Church, a potent and exclusive joining of sacred music, belief, and beauty, could be electrifying, and it left a very strong impression on Belle. On April 2, 1854, less than 2 weeks before Belle's April birthday, her sister Adelia Stewart died of fever. She was just to turn 12. There are no images of Adelia, no books with her name inscribed on a page, no letters or handiwork. She was buried first at Prospect Cemetery in Jamaica, Long Island, in a colonial area land connected to Madame Stewart's church, and later reburied in the family mausoleum at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. "In the midst of life, we are in death," was the opening line to a prayer Belle would have known well from her church's Book of Common Prayer. The stark reminder appeared too in sermons and stitch samplers. Sudden loss, the kind that the Stewarts experienced, shakes foundations, as it must have done for Belle those spring days of her 14th year, with her parents in disarray from grief and worry and burning questions. Why her? Who's next? And more calamities followed. Slide. Belle's parents recorded their losses in light and color, commissioning a set of stained glass windows by the British pre-Raphaelite artist Henry Holliday for Grace Church's sanctuary. Installed in 1883, when Belle was traveling through Asia, the windows are known as the Raising of Lazarus and Jairus' daughter. They remain today in memory of Adelia and also of Belle's brothers, David Jr., who died of brain cancer in 1874, and James, who died in 1881 at the Stewart home at the age of 22 of malarial fever. Belle would see her mother and father when visiting in New York until their deaths in 1886 and 1891, respectively. Presumably, she attended Grace Church when in the city, but she made no record of the windows, nor of the siblings' death they commemorated in her letters or private papers. Even so, a line moves from Grace Church to Belle's future museum in Boston. In constructing Fenway Court all those years later, she testified to her vision of life through a circuitous return to a sacred space of her childhood, where relishing artistic splendor was a profound form of worship and remembrance. As innovative and sui generis as the museum was, it also followed a family path. Belle did as her parents had done, but on a much larger scale. She transformed overwhelming personal loss into art, into beauty. Slide. Bright colors catch the eye first. Blazing reds, grassy yellows and greens, sharp blues. The rectangular panel, made up of 105 pieces of gleaming glass, is set in a dark wood frame placed against an exterior wall of clear glass. A garden is in view beyond. The panel, located in the Chinese loggia on the museum's first floor, is not very large, though it seems bigger when the sun pours in from the east, spreading rays of intense color over the stone floor. Slide. A close look reveals in two pieces of glass, I'm going to say that again. A close look reveals faces in two pieces of glass. In the first fragment on the lower right, one eye peers back, like that of a cyclops. The second, larger face, is above the first, more in the center and in three-quarter profile. Its outline is traced, like that of the first, in a brownish line over a dull background. Its half-quizzical expression, eyes looking up, seems to say, "What's this? Where did I come from? How did I get here?" The glass pieces came from the windows of the 13th century cathedral at Rheims, located northeast of Paris, under whose soaring choir France once crowned her medieval kings. The catastrophic assault on the church came in September 1914 as Germans bombarded the edifice in successive raids, which set the ancient oak-timbered roof on fire. The lead in the windows dripped to the floor, igniting many of the interior furnishings. Soldiers picked up shards of stained glass scattered throughout the city to set into rings for their sweethearts. The cathedral became iconic as a martyr of stone, and photographs of the first and worst bombings in 1914 were reproduced on postcards and in newspapers around the world. In 1918, when it seemed likely that the city and its cathedral would be completely destroyed, Chester A. Howell, an American ambulance driver from Dorchester, Massachusetts, attached to the American Field Service, gathered and boxed up 100+ pieces of scattered cathedral glass. Slide. He sent them to Henry Sleeper, instructing him to give the collection to Isabella in recognition for her help to the American Field Service. And this is her ambulance that she sponsored. Soon after, Sleeper presented the reconstituted panel to Isabella. Slide. The panel does not form a portrait or landscape. It is modernist in its sensibility, focusing on shape and color as things in themselves. The artisans who composed it remain anonymous. How to value something created from such a mishmash of materials, centuries, and makers, a mere patch of color, an early museum curator called it, and yet, like everything in Isabella's museum, it is more. Pieces from the far past memorialize the less distant past, one era reaching to another. Isabella Stewart Gardner's life had been split into before and after with the loss of her only child. Her grief consumed her. She hid away, she floundered. Slowly, over a long time, she came back to life. The panel made from cathedral glass memorializes the tragedy of the Great War, but it is eloquent too of Fenway Court, with its assemblage of artistic styles and periods, and the woman behind its creation. Isabella, like the small, inquiring face near the panel's center, looked up. In the blasted aftermath of loss, she put bits and pieces of beauty together into something new. Life is filled with far too much destruction and loss, and yet it can shine with light and color. She knew both enduring truths. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. We have some time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Natalie, raise your hand. She'll call on you. And unfortunately, we don't have the technical capacity to take a microphone to you. So stand up, speak your question loudly, and hopefully Natalie can repeat some of it at the answer.
Yes.
Hi. So I was wondering, I know that it seemed as though Jack was maybe from Boston, but she was so fiery, why didn't she make him move to New York?
That's a very good question. Yes, that's a very good question. Because he was part of a Boston Brownman family, and all his business interests were in Boston. And so that is where they settled. But that is a very good question. Yes, I think, and they would come, sometimes she would come by herself to New York for a visit to her family, but I don't think that was even a question. That's the first time I've had that question, actually. I don't think it was a debate between them. She would have gone where he was settled, and his family had been there since the Revolution, surely. Oh, there I am. So it's a good question, thank you. Yes.
I've been to the museum. It's beautiful. I know a lot about the collection. It's amazing, so you should all go visit. But I don't know anything about the salons. Can you speak about the salons that she used to have in the house?
Yes. So the question is, having been at the museum and enjoyed the galleries, but she also had hosted a lot of performances at the museum. She sure did. And she really saw, so music was as important to her as painting was. And she wanted to give younger musicians and composers an opportunity to have an audience. And so, in fact, the museum, as we see it now, actually when she opened it, had a 2-story music room where the Spanish cloister is now. And she redid the museum in 1915. So, but she also had dramatic performances, playwrights. She had lectures there. She had, if there was a visiting intellectual or writer, they would often have an occasion at the Gardner, at the museum, absolutely. And at first, when she first moved to Boston, she was not very, she was considered an outsider, right? But by the 1880s, late 1880s, early 90s, people started to accept her invitations because they were so interesting. They didn't know if they were going to see a play by an Italian playwright, or they didn't know what they were, but they didn't want to miss it. They didn't want to miss it. But yes, and she also always had an artist in residence, a program that was revived in the 1990s by Ann Hawley, and is now such an important part of the museum. But the very first artist in residence was John Singer Sargent. Oh, yeah. So the program starts off very well. Yeah. Does that answer some of your questions? Yeah. She wanted it to be full of people and artistic energy, and she was not afraid of now or the future. Even though a lot of her collection was the Italian Renaissance and centuries back, she was unafraid of art to come. So she was an honorary sponsor of the Armory Show, for instance, and so she was very interested in engaging with young artists and writers, and particularly if they were handsome, then that was really always a good thing. Yeah. Question way back there. Hi.
You talked about her relationship with Henry James, and I'm curious if there is anything more to be said about her relationship with one, Edith Wharton,
Oh, yeah.
two, Edith Thackeray.
So, say the second name again.
Edith Thackeray, a possible redeemer on the other side.
Yeah, that one I don't know about. I do know a little bit about Edith Wharton. They were 18 years apart. Gardner was older, obviously, and so really almost a generation apart. And there has always been this story, and I looked and looked and looked to see if I could find, finally get to the foundational evidence for it, but it's in so many different accounts that when Wharton was at the opening of the museum in January of 1903, the food was served in the Dutch room, and it was champagne and donuts. And Wharton said in French, not knowing that Gardner spoke fluent French, "This is food you'd get at a train station, for heaven's sakes." And Gardner apparently turned to her and said, "Well, you'll never have to be at this train station again." So it's a complicated, they had so much in common. That's it's sort of sad, because you would love to have had them in conversation with each other, because they both loved houses, they both loved art, they both loved music, and she had all of Wharton's novels in her library, in her personal library, but she didn't make notations on her margins like some other historical figures. Henry Adams has all these wonderful notations in his book, so you always know what he's he's thinking when he's reading. But Gardner kept her books very clean that way, and so you don't know what her reaction is. I will say this: there is these wonderful moments, both in Berenson's letters, Bernard Berenson, her art dealer, who was close friends also with Wharton, and in the Henry James letters, where they're trying to hide the fact from Gardner that they had just seen Wharton. Right? So you can hear them trying to keep them apart, right? Which is just fascinating, a little social gossip that's sort of fascinating. But yeah, certainly, I mean, they shared this church too, right? And yeah, I wish. Yes?
So my question was, we know that Wharton was then not invited to go back to the museum. Who was invited to go? When it opened in 1903, who did she want to come? Was it just the or everybody?
Well, there were two openings, of course. The first was January 1st of 1903, and the second was in February. The February one was the much larger one. To sort of, it was a much bigger party. But the first was to sort of an exclusive guest list. I think it was 100 in the guest list, and it was Charles Eliot Norton. And there's a great photograph of William James and his wife Alice walking toward Fenway Court for the opening night. And, the list is long. Julia Ward Howe, there's a description of what Julia Ward wore, and her daughter Maud Howe, and really kind of the who's who in Boston at the time. I think Henry James was elsewhere. He didn't actually get to see the museum until 1906, I think. Yeah, because he was in England. So, and then she made him wait. She made Henry James wait. So they made all these plans that he was going to come to Fenway Court, and then she said, I need you to wait for 2 months. And he kind of gripes about that in another letter to a friend. Why is Mrs. Gardner making me wait? So it was really kind of the elite of Boston that came to that first opening. Yes? What? More in the center. Okay, here I am, more in the center, my husband says. Hello, yes?
So I wondered if you could talk more about her connection with contemporary artists of her time. She obviously had a great sense of classical art, but she did foster new artists, which is part of her legacy. And I see her as very similar to Peggy Guggenheim.
Yes.
They were like cultural scions who saw a moment and invested in it and made it even stronger than it would have been.
Yes.
I'm curious about how she found these artists. Was it through her dealer? How did she make these relationships?
Oh, those are really, really good questions. And so the name that comes immediately to mind is a young painter, Dennis Bunker, who in the 1880s it was hard to make a living as a painter, right? And so she helped him with that part of it, with the financial part of it, and I think also just wrote him incredibly encouraging letters about his landscapes, and then he tragically dies. He dies in 1891 of a stroke, I think, in his early 40s, and this was an enormous grief to her. So she's also, this is a little bit off the question of young artists, but I'm going to go to her relationships to younger curators. So she made a lot of friends with the curators who were working at the MFA, which wasn't yet in the Fenway, it was still downtown. But they would often come for tea, to talk, and so that's how she got to know Akakura, who was the first curator of Japanese art at the MFA, and of course that has the largest collection of Japanese art of any U.S. museum because of William Sturgis Bigelow. And it was really through William Sturgis Bigelow, the collector, that she met Akakura. And that was a very deep friendship that seemed very important to trace, and it was through him that she got interested in Asian art. Not only through him, but also through him. So it was, Sargent was quite a bit younger but by the time he was he gave her glory more than her giving him glory, because by the time she was an artist in residence at Fenway Court, he was very famous. So that's a good, yeah. Yeah, so thank you so much for that excellent question. Yes, yes. The turning point purchases, are you saying? Yes. You know, that's I'll speak about how I wrote about them in the book, because I think you can tell a different story. I think depending on your point of view and how you're entering into the collection in a certain way. But I always thought that the purchase of the Vermeer in Paris in 1892 was a turning point, because she made an arrangement with her Paris agent to, a woman couldn't be at the Hotel de Row in Paris, which is the famous auction house there. So she made an arrangement that she would sit outside the auction room where he could see her and hold a white handkerchief against her face. And when she took it down, that the bid then she was out of the bid. And so they had this signaling system, and she got the Vermeer, the concert, which was one of the paintings that was later stolen, for $6,000. And the other Vermeers in that famous auction of Tor Berger's collection, there were 5 in all. The others went to London Gallery, National Gallery in London. 2 went to the National Gallery in London. So, I think that gave her a lot of confidence. That's also when she inherited her father's estate, because her father died in 1891. And so that's when the collecting really accelerates. I think the Botticelli, she has the first Botticelli, the Tragedy of Lucretia. She has the first Botticelli in the United States. And then, of course, the masterpiece, and I was in conversation with the art critic Sebastian Smee, who called it the most important painting in an American collection. I think he said that. He said, even though that's a very brave thing to say, he did say it, is the Titian's Rape of Europa. That really was an astonishing purchase. And there's these extraordinary letters to Berenson when she's waiting for the Titian to arrive, because of course it didn't get on a plane. It was boxed up and put on a ship, and then these collectors would get terrified about storms. They would track weather reports, right? Because they'd be so afraid of their paintings, their treasures in transit. And people lost millions, hundreds of thousands of dollars like that. So those are the 3 that always come to my mind the most quickly. And, it took a long, long time. I think what I was fascinated about in her story was the shape of her life, right? So she has this terrible loss and a long quiet, and then she really gets educated. And part of her education is this training of her eye and finding what she likes immediately. She starts to really develop her taste. And she made mistakes. The worst mistakes is she bought, she thought it was a half portrait of the Pope by Velázquez, and it was a copy of a half portrait of a Pope. And she'd spent $50,000 on it, and it was the wrong Pope. So, yeah, good question. I hope that answered it a little bit.
So, without further ado, thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, my heart. Thank you, Travis. Thank you I'll never forget this night. I will never forget it. Thank you.